Hey everyone, thanks for joining us here for our series called Go Old School. This is an online series to help get you offline. I'm going to throw the outline here on the screen so that you can see where we're at in this series. As you can see, we've divided this series into two main parts, our scripture reading time and our prayer time. And judging by the title, you can tell that we're in our last episode in our scripture reading time with a method called rewrite. So let me talk about what this method actually is. Before we get into that, let me just say that this method, along with the Go Long method, these are the easiest methods in this series. But I'm sure most of you can probably guess what this method actually is simply by the title of it. Because it's one of the simplest methods. You're just going to rewrite the scripture. That's it. All you have to do is to the how. All you have to do is pick a book of the Bible, grab a pen and paper, or I would actually suggest more a journal, and you're going to rewrite everything, word for word, until you finish the book. And that's it. That's the method. Now, let me give just some quick tips or things that I've seen with people who have done this method before we get into the why, which is really the meat of this video. Now, I've most often seen this method applied to 4 books of the Bible in particular. And those are the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, you can use this plan with any book of the Bible at all. But I do think there is something particularly unique about applying this plan to the 4 Gospels because it just provides a different sort of context and framework for this plan, and that's actually something we're going to get into here right now. Let's talk about the why this plan is important. And I've actually just gave you the word as for the why this plan is important. It's a word we've talked about frequently before. That word is context. But I think for this plan in particular, I think context applies in 2 areas. And I think that's the scriptural context, but also the historical context. So let's first talk about the scriptural context and what I mean by that. When I say scriptural context, I'm referring to the verses of scripture and how they correspond and relate to one another within the contexts of that author's thought, as in the verse that you're reading, that author's whole letter, and actually also that author's entire body of work. So, for instance, if you were to examine on a surface level the biblical author John, you'd find there's a phrase he uses extremely often in all of his works, which is the phrase the world. He uses it quite often. Now, this area of scriptural context in relation to John's use of the word the world, I think this applies in 3 areas. First is the author's thought, which is what does John mean by the world in this particular verse or in this particular thought. But it also then applies to what does John mean by the world in this particular letter. Does he only use the world in one way in this letter, or does he use it in multiple ways in this letter? And then lastly, to get even bigger context, is how does John use the phrase the world throughout all of his letters, and is this phrasing in particular unique, or is it like others? Now, using this particular method with the author John, the rewrite method, you could take this plan and embark to rewrite all of John's body of work. That would be the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and the book of Revelation. And that would be a great method or a great application for this method. Right, so this method helps with scriptural context simply because the intentionality this plan actually takes. By rewriting word for word what the author wrote, you can begin to see the author's thought process as he was writing and what he intended by what he wrote. So, and that actually moves us into our second point. When I say his thought process and what he intended, that moves us to our second point of context, which is historical context. This method, I think, is one of the best methods for teaching a Christian really at any stage in their journey with Christ, the historical context of Scripture. And you see, because oftentimes we can get confused, or maybe we've never even really been taught how we got this thing called the Bible. This video isn't going to be a full history lesson on that. That's a topic for a whole nother video on its own. But sometimes it can seem like, or we can just believe because we don't know any better, that this book called the Bible just descended from the clouds and landed on our lap as is, with all the verse numbers, chapter numbers written in English just for us. But that's just not the case. Each book of the Bible has both a human author and a single divine author. Right? The divine author, we would say, is God. He's the author of all of Scripture. But each book in particular has its own human author that physically penned the words. So let's use again the author John to talk about historical context. In his gospel, he sat and penned that book originally actually as a letter, as something to be read and distributed to others. Right? Well, how do we know this? Well, John tells us, like any good author of a letter or writer of a letter, he tells us why he wrote the letter. Right? We see this in John 20, verses 30 and 31. He says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. All right, so when we talk about why the rewrite method is important, it's important because it places you in the best place to understand how this book that you're reading came to be and how to understand what you're reading. Right? To sit and rewrite the author's words, word for word, is to help understand that when they wrote this, that they wrote this for a particular reason with a particular meaning in mind. This then, historical context, actually loops us back into our scriptural context. So let me give an example to show this loop and how it takes place. There's a verse of scripture that almost everyone knows, including non-Christians, and that's Philippians 4:13, which is, I am able to do all things through him, that is Christ, who gives me strength. Right? And this verse has been taken and said to mean many, many different things. But if you were to take and apply this plan, you would recognize Paul didn't write this verse to mean that you can excel in some sporting event. He didn't even really write this as some general encouraging statement that you can put on a coffee mug to encourage you when your work and chores are backing up to help you finish the day. By rewriting Paul's own words in the book of Philippians, you would be able to see that he is in prison when he is writing this, and he is suffering dearly as a result. And yet, he says he is able to be content. That is, he is able to be at peace in the particular situation that God has given him, because Jesus has given him the strength to be able to be content and to be at peace, suffering in prison with little food and none of the comforts of this life. I just want to say this as we wrap up. The rewrite method is a method that will grow your knowledge of Scripture and deepen your faith through the intentionality of rewriting the text. So that's going to be all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these scripture reading methods, and I hope you're excited as we move on to a few different prayer time methods for your quiet time. Thanks. We'll see you next time.